Bush will still be president. So if you're a swing voter, you voted for Bush in '04, but you're unhappy, the Republicans have messed up Iraq, they've spent too much, you don't like this, that about the Republican congressional leadership, it's pretty easy to cast a vote for a Democrat this time and feel like you're not really setting the country on a different course. That's 2008. So if 2006 is a backward-looking election, if it's a referendum on what's happened, it's just hard for the governing party to hold on, and they'll lose some seats, and then the question is, will they lose enough to lose a majority in either the House or the Senate? Presidential elections tend to be about the future. Who do you want to lead the country for the next 4 years? So this is, but off-year elections are tough for the party that governs. I think that's the fundamental fact.
First time we met, you were working for Vice President Dan Quayle, Chief of Staff. Go back to the 1992 campaign, 12 years of the Reagan-Bush administrations, 12 years of the Republicans in the White House. Why did Vice President Quayle and President Bush lose that election?
Well, we were pretty exhausted. I think the Republican Party as a governing institution was. The voters sensed that. Clinton ran a very smart campaign. The first Bush administration was running out of steam. Again, they got blamed. They didn't get credit. When you think back, it's sort of amazing. Reagan and Bush together presided over the end of the Cold War, complete U.S. victory over the evil empire with amazingly few casualties. Really done in quite a skillful way. They got no credit for that. Voters looked forward in '92. They said, what's going to be the story for the next 4 or 8 years? Domestic policy, health care, education, the economy. Did the first President Bush look like he was on top of those issues? No. I mean, he probably was more than people realized, but that was the perception. And so voters said, we'll take Clinton for the next 4 years. That's what I mean about presidential elections being forward-looking. You don't get much credit for what you've done. And that's, I think, what happened in '92.
So is it easy in the confines of the White House for any administration to be nimble, to be able to react politically to the events that are happening around them, whether it's Bill Clinton or George Bush or George W. Bush?
No, it's not. I mean, I would say we did not react in that first Bush administration to the massive fact of what had happened on our watch, which was the end of the Cold War. The first President Bush thought, I'll get credit for this. You know, we've done a pretty good job. We were right, and the Democrats were wrong. The Reagan defense buildup didn't lead to nuclear war. It led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, among other things that contributed to that. But the voters looked at it and didn't give them credit. They said, the Cold War's over. We don't have to worry so much about national security. Let's elect a president who will focus on the economy. Very hard in a White House, especially when you've come up in a certain mindset, to pivot and to figure out how to deal with new circumstances. Plus, people just get tired, you get dug in, you get defensive. You know, your friends are over there getting attacked, you want to defend them. Very hard to step back and say, you know what, maybe, let me give you an example from this administration. I've called for Rumsfeld to be replaced as defense secretary. Very hard for a president, though, to say this guy's been with me for 6 years and he's taken all these attacks, some of them unjust, and I'm now going to make a kind of cold-blooded judgment that he should go and someone else should come in. So you do tend to get too dug in, I think, and can't adjust as much as you should.
Politically, though, is it a double-edged sword? If he lets him go, is he going to be attacked from the Democrats? If he keeps him on, he's still going to be attacked.
Well, that's true, and it looks weak, people think, and I would say right now it's too late. I mean, we're just 7 weeks away, is that right, from Election Day? Bush now has to play the hand he's got. The interesting question for me is what happens, you know, in November. Does the president have one more opportunity there, a window, no matter what happens in the off-year election, to say, I have 2 more years to govern. You could not drift through 2 years. The world is too dangerous. You can't just hang on and play defense for 2 years. He's got to really think to himself, how do I govern most effectively for the next 2 years, whether it's with a Democratic House or a Democratic Senate or a Republican House or a Republican Senate. So I think there's a window there for him to, in a way, give himself a booster shot for his own administration, somewhat regardless of the election results.
Let's get to some questions, and since Bill Kristol was at Pace University, we'll begin with the students from Pace and Chris Malone's group. Go ahead.
Thank you, Steve. Mr. Kristol, good to see you again.
Good to see you.
And thank you for being
good to see you.
Thanks for being down here at, or up here at Pace a couple of weeks ago. You did speak to some of our students then, and we have pretty much a different group here. We're actually in Midtown, and those of the students here know that since George Bush spoke at the United Nations, Midtown is crazy right now with all types of barricades and whatnot. Our first question here is going to be from Mike Martin right here in the front row. Go ahead, Mike.
Hi, Mr. Kristol. My question is, you mentioned in an article from 2004 that America needs to act and end genocide now in Sudan. But the current Bush administration has worked with Sudanese intelligence officials saying officially that Sudan is proving a valuable ally in the war on terror. Some of these allies, specifically Major General Salah Abdallah Ghash, head of the Sudanese intelligence agency is suspected of helping orchestrate the genocide. In your opinion, which is more valuable, an ally in terror or an ally in the war on terror, or stopping the genocide?
No, I think we should act aggressively to stop the genocide. I've been calling for more aggressive action for quite a while, as have many other people. And to be fair to the Bush administration, it's pushed pretty hard on that, certainly harder than almost any other state at the, at the United Nations or in Europe. I don't know about this one person and whether, the CIA just felt there was such important intelligence they could get from him that they could do that without compromising the general push against the Sudanese regime. Bush again has raised this issue just recently, expressed frustration with the UN on Sudan, and it's a very tough issue, obviously. But I myself would be willing to endorse more aggressive actions. We shouldn't kid ourselves. It's not so easy to go in there and stop it, and it might require actual military action. It might require regime change, which the truth is, otherwise you're sort of putting a Band-Aid on the problem. And lots of people who, regime change isn't easy, and lots of people get nervous, understandably, when you say maybe we would have to go in and really be tough if we wanted to stop this. But I myself think it would be worth it, because I think the cost of sort of saying this is unacceptable and then not doing anything is to tell other people around the world, well, I guess we can get away with it. So leaving aside the terrible disaster in Sudan itself, it has a ripple effect, which is very dangerous elsewhere.
Did you want to follow up on that? I saw you shaking your head on his response.
Actually, I agree with your points in that the ripple effect especially is very meaningful around the world, because the United States, obviously, as much as we may not want to or want to, we do set the example. So I do think it is important that we set the example and be aggressive about it.
Thanks for the question. Next, we'll go to George Mason. I can also see the Denver students in the monitor, so if you want to raise your hands in Denver, I'll get to you in just a moment. But Steve Klein, next question.
Thank you, Steve, and I want to welcome Mr. Kristol back to George Mason University, where he has been a member of our Board of Visitors. So welcome back. I have a quick question for you, then I would like to go to a student, if I may. Can you define some terms for us, and those terms being, who is the enemy? What do we call them? You used jihadist before. President Bush and conservatives or people on the right side have said Islamic fascists. We call them terrorists. Are we fighting Sunni and Shia in Iraq? Are we fighting Taliban in Afghanistan? Just who is the enemy, and what do we call them?
First of all, I'm glad to be back with people from George Mason. I was on the Board of Visitors for 3 years, and Governor Allen, just before he stepped down as governor, called and asked me if I would serve on this, and I was honored to do it. It's a very impressive public university in Northern Virginia. George Mason really does a good job. I didn't realize I was going to get in the middle of an incredibly bitter and contentious argument about whether they should have a Division I football team or not, and I cast the deciding vote on the Board of Visitors against going for a football team, which I thought there were like enough Division I football teams basically in Virginia and Northern and this area, and it's an awful big expenditure and they could spend the money better. And I want to say that I made the argument, I believe, at the Board of Visitors meeting that you can get a lot, I mean, obviously football gets you a lot of attention, it's good for recruiting students sometimes, but I said you could have a good soccer team, have a good basketball team, and that can get you attention. And I'm taking, therefore, personal credit for George Mason's Final Four appearance last
predictions for this year? How do you think they're going to do?
I don't follow it well enough, but I was thrilled to see them go so far last year. On the enemy, in a way, I don't think it's as big a problem as some people do. We know who I call them jihadists because that's what they call themselves. Communists call themselves communists. These people think they're waging jihad. I don't see why we shouldn't just take them at their word and say that these are jihadists who want to spread Islam, their version of Islam, not all of Islam, by force, by brutal force, by intimidation, by terror. And we're going to stand up to that, stand with other Muslims and others in the Middle East and elsewhere who don't want that. And we need to fight them because they clearly are expansionists, they clearly are aggressive. I think that's the key in thinking about the current moment. This is a very aggressive, sort of dynamic, if you will, movement. And they've had success in recruiting people, obviously in many parts of the world. It has different elements, just as communism had Chinese communism and Soviet communism. There's Sunni and Shia. There are differences among Sunnis. Still, they have in common a desire to drive us out of the Middle East, to prevent moderate Arab regimes or moderate Islamist regimes from emerging, to insist on Sharia in every land that they're in and export it to some additional lands. So I think that's a pretty clear enemy. Then they have some dictatorships that are not themselves jihadists that kind of support them or buy them off, and that's another kind of problem. So it's a complex war, but all wars are pretty complex. You know, we talk about World War II now as if it was simple, but of course the Japanese weren't the same as the Germans, the Italians weren't the same as the Japanese or the Germans. The Soviet Union was in alliance with Nazi Germany for the first, 2 years, year and a half, 2 years of the war. I mean, these are complicated wars, and you have to be a little bit subtle in therefore how you conduct them. But I think we know basically who the enemy is.
But to follow up on Steve Klein's point, because when President Bush refers to them as Islamic fascists, and of course we know what fascism means to all of us, for those who have studied history, and you have the Defense Secretary who refers to those who might oppose the war as to the Neville Chamberlains of the world, to the appeasers. Those are strong words.
Yeah. I mean, the Islamic fascist, I think, is a reasonable term in the sense that fascism, I mean, it's imprecise in certain ways. Fascism was more nationalist, and these people are transnationalists. They don't believe in the nation state. Most of the jihadists, they want a, Islamic Ummah or something which, transcends the nation state. Still, insofar as fascism was violent, dictatorial, aggressive, sometimes almost apocalyptic, it's not unreasonable to ascribe that term to these to elements, at least, of the jihadists. And indeed, Christopher Hitchens and Paul Berman, and perfectly respectable people who are not, in the case of Berman, a Bush supporter even, and in the case of both of them, come from the left, have used the term. So I mean, I don't have a strong view one way or the other. I'm not sure it's the absolute perfect term to use. Appeasement is, again, these analogies are all limited, but I don't think it's ridiculous to say that there are people, as there were people who were public-spirited and decent people in the 30s who thought the way to deal with this threat was to pull back or not to pick a fight here or here or here. And I tend to think in this case, too, that that will be a mistake.
Let's stay with George Mason, and another question from the students. Steve Klein.
Thank you, Steve. Dua?
Hi, my name is Duhal Quisney, Egyptian background, born in Queens, New York, and raised in Fairfax. My question is about your book, the New York Times bestseller titled The War Over Iraq, Saddam's Tyranny and America's Mission. In the book, you rationalize America's invasion of Iraq, stating that Saddam Hussein is a dictator who threatens both his own people and the world, and therefore must be stopped before he does further harm. The book illustrates several reasons as to why America should go further with their invasion, such as weapons of mass destruction, Saddam's links to Al-Qaeda and 9/11, and because of Saddam's undemocratic form of government, and of course because he's pure evil. Just in the past couple of months, however, stories have been published and evidence has been put forth disputing these claims. These claims have now been refuted by the UN, NATO, and even some Republicans. So with this new evidence brought to light, do you still stand by these specific claims you made in your book? Do you believe that the U.S. should have tried longer and harder to take diplomatic procedures rather than declare war as quickly as they did?
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I pretty much stand by the book. Obviously, there were some things where we depended on UN reports about the weapons of mass destruction that Saddam hadn't disclosed, where we assumed he still had them, and he apparently let them disintegrate in some cases or got rid of them in some way or other. But there's no question he had the weapons. There's no question he was in violation of UN resolutions. There's no question that he had killed hundreds of thousands of his own people, used weapons of mass destruction on his own people, and for that matter on Iran. And no question he had links with terror groups. Which is not to say that he was behind 9/11, but he certainly had links with terror groups and with Al-Qaeda. So I stand behind the case for the war, and I think it was necessary to do it. And I don't think there was such a rush to war. I mean, you mentioned the letter we sent in 1998. Bill Clinton said in January, February 98, we can't let this go on forever. We need to act to resolve the situation, the question of Saddam, one way or the other. When we went to war, we were monitoring no-fly zones. I mean, it's not exactly, it wasn't a peaceful situation anyway. And basically the choice would have been to let him get out of the sanctions and I think reconstitute his weapons and basically sponsor radicalism and terrorism around the Middle East or go in and get rid of him. So it was a tough choice. I think we made the right choice, and I think the argument was basically correct.
Next question, we'll go to University of Denver, and Amy, if there's a question from one of the students, is it Maxwell? Ryan, did you have your hand up? Aaron.
Oh, we have two
okay.
X's. Which
Aaron.
one did? Okay. Aaron, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah, hi, how are you?
My question is, what is your take on the incident regarding the Pope's speech the other day, which seems to have enraged a large amount of Muslims all over the world? Do you think that that will have any serious backlash?
It's interesting. I read actually the text of the Pope's speech